Chapter 4. Modern research explores the Khazar past. Isaac Jost took an interest in the Khazars and wrote about them. Later, so did Heinrich Graetz. The wisps of Khazar history available in the 19th century were the letters of Hasdai and Joseph. Despite the differences between these two notable historians, they shared the German condescension toward the culture of Eastern Europe, especially its Jews. Furthermore, in seeking to reconstruct the history of the Jews, they looked in particular for its spiritual expressions. The scanty Khazar output could make no impression on these hyper-Germanic intellectuals. Jost placed no credence at all in Joseph's letter, and Graetz, who indulged in descriptions, wrote that before their conversion to Judaism, the Khazars professed a coarse religion, which was combined with sensuality and lewdness. This was characteristic rhetoric, a systematic erasure of the past proselytes who had swelled the ranks of the chosen people. Graetz, with his basic positivist approach, gave credence to the Hebrew correspondence between Hasdai and the king, just as he believed all the biblical stories. It seems he was momentarily captivated by the image of the mighty kingdom of the Jewish Khazars, and was also convinced that Judaism had spread through much of its population. Yet in the final analysis, he viewed the Khazars' Judaization as a passing phenomenon, without significance, which had no effect on the history of the Jews. But if the historians of Ashkenaz did not attribute much importance to the Khazars, Eastern European scholars looked at it differently. In Russia, Ukraine and Poland there was lively interest in the lost Jewish kingdom, especially among the Jewish Russian scholars. In 1834, V. Grigoriev, an early scholar at the St. Petersburg School of Eastern Studies, published a study about the Khazars, in which he stated, "An unusual phenomenon in the Middle Ages was the Khazar people. In the midst of wild nomadic tribes, it had all the qualities of a civilized nation, orderly administration, flourishing commerce and a standing army. Khazaria was a bright meteor that shone in Europe's dark sky." In the early 19th century, the idea that the Russian nation emerged in the light of a Jewish kingdom did not seem strange. Interest in Khazaria spread following this pioneering study, and other historians began to research the subject from a sympathetic viewpoint that tended to glorify the Khazar past. At this time, Russian nationalism was in its infancy, and it was possible to show generosity to the exotic ancient Slavic peoples in the East. Echoes of these works reached the Jewish communities as well. In 1838, Joseph Pearl published his satiric book Boen Zadik, containing 41 letters from imaginary rabbis concerning various aspects of Jewish life, including some mentions of the Khazars. Letter 25 discussed past doubts about the Judaization of the Eastern Kingdom, contrary to the current scientific confirmation of the statements in Hasdai's letter, though not in Joseph's letter. Another supposed rabbi wrote in response that he was happy to learn about the historical existence of the Khazars. Interest in Khazaria did not end there, and it grew stronger in the second half of the century. For example, in 1867 two books appeared that dealt directly and indirectly with Khazar history. One was a short work by Joseph Yehudar Lerner, entitled The Khazars, the other, Abraham A. Harkavy's The Jews and the Language of the Slavs. Lerner trusted the Hebrew correspondence and relied on it rather uncritically. He already knew some of the Arab chronicles, and he used them to complete the historical reconstruction. But what is most interesting about his essay is his refusal to date the fall of the Khazar kingdom to 965, or 969, CE. He argued that a Jewish kingdom persisted in the Crimean Peninsula, ruled by a king named David, and that only in 1016, following the Byzantine conquest, did the independent Jewish monarchy fall apart and the large Jewish population turn to Karaism. Lerner concludes with a defense of the findings of Abram Ferkovich, who, as we have seen, was accused by other scholars of forging and distorting Jewish tombstone inscriptions, all of which suggests that Lerner himself came from a Karaite background. One of the most trenchant critics of Ferkovich and of the Karaite hypothesis was Abraham Harkavy, an early Jewish Russian historian. In 1877 Harkivy was appointed head of the Department of Jewish Literature and Oriental Manuscripts in the Imperial Public Library in St. Petersburg, a post he retained for the rest of his life. He was a cautious and pedantic researcher, and his works, The Jews and the Language of the Slavs and other works about the Khazars, notably stories by Jewish writers on the Khazars and the Khazar kingdom, are regarded as reliable studies. He had no doubt that there were many Jews in Khazaria, and that they practiced rabbinical Judaism. It was he who in 1874 discovered in Furkovich's collection the longer version of King Joseph's letter, and his profound knowledge of Eastern tradition and literature made him a leading scholar on the subject of the Khazars. The Orientalist Daniel Abramovich Cholson, a baptized Jew, was a colleague of his, with whom Harkivy argued intensely. By the time Dunlop consolidated his status in Jewish historiography, there was already a fair amount of material on Khazaria. The Cambridge document was published in 1912, and in the first half of the 20th century the Hasdai-Joseph correspondence began to be treated as a trustworthy source, even though it had been extensively redacted. In his comprehensive oeuvre World History of the Jewish People, Dunlop devoted more space to the Khazar kingdom than did his predecessors Jost and Graetz. He outlined the development of the kingdom, described in vivid terms its voluntary Judaization on the basis of King Joseph's letter, and trusted the bulk of the Arab chronicles. Like Graetz, he was impressed by Khazaria's great power, but he did not fail to stress that only the higher strata converted, while the middle and lower classes remained pagan, Muslim, or Christian. He added a special appendix including a long bibliographic analysis, and stated that the story of the Khazars is one of the most problematic issues in the history of the Jews. But he did not explain why that was so. There seems to be some awkwardness in his writing on the subject, though the reason for it is unclear. Perhaps it was the fact that those tricky Khazars were not exactly the ethno-biological descendants of Israel, and their history was alien to the Jewish meta-narrative. The Soviet government in its early days encouraged the study of Khazaria, and young historians enthusiastically began to research Russia's pre-imperial past. Between the early 1920s and the mid-1930s, this resulted in a wave of historiographical production whose findings were unhesitatingly idealized. The Soviet scholars' sympathy was due to the fact that the Khazar Empire was not ruled by the Orthodox Church, and was tolerant of and open to all religions. The fact that it was a Jewish kingdom did not disturb the researchers, especially since many of them, for all their conspicuous Marxism, came from a Jewish background. Why not inject a little Jewish pride into the spirit of proletarian internationalism? But the most prominent of these scholars were not of Jewish origin. In 1932, Pavel Kakovtsev published all the Hebrew Khazar documents in a systematic critical work, and although he expressed reservations about the authenticity of some of them, the publication itself encouraged further research as well as archaeological excavations in the region of the lower Don River. The archaeological mission was led by young Mikhail Artimonov, who published his summaries in Studies on Khazaria's Ancient History. This work conformed to the Russian and Soviet tradition of being sympathetic to the Khazar narrative, and it lauded the ancient rulers who nurtured the embryonic Kievan Russia. The great Soviet interest in Khazaria, and its prominent place in the historiography of southeastern Europe influenced the work of Jewish scholars outside the USSR. For example, between the two world wars the important Polish Jewish historian Yitzhak Schipper devoted several chapters in his books to Khazar history. Baron, too, in his comprehensive oeuvre, was determined to examine the Khazar phenomenon at length. Where Dunlop included Khazar history as a legitimate chapter in the history of the Jewish people, Baron, writing in the late 1930s, treated it, surprisingly, as a major issue, as we shall see. Despite Baron's essentially ethnocentric outlook, he did not hesitate to tackle the Khazar conundrum and install it in the history of the Jews. To integrate the Khazars into that sequence, he assumed that there had been a massive migration of Jews into the Khazarian territories, making its population mixed Khazar Jewish, as he put it. Other than that, Baron's Khazar narrative is solid, and based on most of the sources available to him at the time. In later editions, published in the late 1950s, he included new analyses and expanded on the subject with many updated clarifications. Dinur did the same in his valuable collection of sources, Israel in Exile. As well as impressive quotes from the Hasdai-Joseph exchange, the Cambridge document, and Arab and Byzantine chronicles, the 1961 edition included numerous scholarly comments and abundant new information. It devoted more than 50 pages to Khazar history, and Dinur adopted a straightforward position about it. The Khazar kingdom, the country of Jews and the cities of Jews within it were historical facts of great significance. They were transformed by the developments of Jewish history, and their impact was felt in the life of the Jewish people, despite their distance from its high road. For such a statement to be made, it was necessary to assume that there had been in Khazaria an early Jewish population, a Jewish tribal community, and that it was because of its presence that the kingdom converted to Judaism. Jewish migration to Khazaria was not merely a trickle of refugees and immigrants who made it to the strange country and proselytized with great skill. There had to have been a continuing Jewish immigration to the country, and the Jews were a significant stratum of the population, bolstering its Jewish element. Now that we are certain that many of the Khazars were Jews by descent, we can take pride in their territorial and military might, and relish the memory of an ancient Jewish sovereignty, a kind of medieval Hasmonean kingdom, but much bigger. Barron's and Dinur's updated Khazar history drew very largely on Abraham Pollock's impressive research. Pollock's book was published in Hebrew in 1944, with 2 further editions, the last one in 1951. Khazaria, The History of a Jewish Kingdom in Europe, was the first comprehensive work on the subject, and although it won a prize from the city of Tel Aviv, it was received in some circles with reservations and mixed reactions. All the reviews praised its broad scope, energy and scholarly thoroughness. Pollock, who was born in Kiev, knew Russian, Turkish, Classical Arabic, Ancient Persian, Latin and probably Greek, and his knowledge of the historical material was impressive. But some reviewers criticized his vertiginous treatment of history, a term used in the title of one of the most abrasive critiques of the book. The author, it said, had overloaded the narrative with myriad details and had extracted more than was necessary from the sources. There is some truth to this argument. In cutting his path through the Khazar world, Pollock followed the same positivist working principles that guided the local historians in reconstructing the history of the First Temple period, and the Second Temple period. But he did so with great skill, and his statements were hard to refute. Pollock's great sin, according to some of the reviews, lay in the assumption that concluded his work. This Israeli scholar asserted categorically that the great bulk of Eastern European Jewry originated in the territories of the Khazar Empire. I cannot imagine what greater joy and honor he grants us with this Turkish-Mongolian genealogy than our Jewish origin, complained the critic made dizzy by the book. But in spite of this and other criticisms, Barron and Dinur drew extensively on Pollock's book and regarded it as the definitive work on the history of the Khazars. Provided, of course, a Jewish ethnobiological seed was planted in the beginning of the history. Pollock's publishers included on the back cover a prominent statement designed to reassure suspicious readers: this empire, Khazaria, was Jewish not only by religion, but because it had a large Israelite population, and proselytized Khazars were only a minority in it. If the proselytes were but a small part of that vast Jewish kingdom, then the Khazar thesis conformed with the Zionist meta-narrative and became more legitimate. The author himself, for all his supposed irresponsibility, was partly aware of the problem and sought to sugarcoat his bitter pill with a comforting ethnocentric palliative. There had been Jewish settlements in the country before the Khazars' conversion, even before the Khazar conquest. There had been a process of Judaization in the kingdom among other, non-Khazar people. There was Jewish immigration from other countries, mainly from Muslim Central Asia, Eastern Iran and Byzantium. Thus a large Jewish community grew there, of which the proselyte Khazars were only a part, and whose cultural character was shaped mainly by the old population of the northern Caucasus and Crimea. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, such phrasing could still more or less meet the demands of Zionist historiography, and as we have seen, De Noor gave this bold move his stamp of approval. Moreover, Pollock was a devout Zionist who gave generously of his intellectual and linguistic capabilities to Israeli military intelligence. At the end of the 1950s he was appointed chairman of Tel Aviv University's Department of Middle Eastern and African History, and in this setting managed to publish several works about the Arab world. But such an independent-minded scholar was not cut out for compromises, and as his historical approach grew increasingly out of step with the dominant reconstruction of Jewish historical memory, he continued to defend his pioneering work. From 1951 to the present moment, not a single historical work about the Khazars has appeared in Hebrew. Nor was Pollock's Khazaria ever reissued. It served till the end of the 1950s as a legitimate point of departure for Israeli researchers, but it lost this status over the years. Except for one modest MA thesis on this subject, and one, published, routine seminar paper, there has been nothing. The Israeli academic world has been mute on this topic, and no significant research has taken place. Slowly and consistently, any mention of the Khazars in the public arena in Israel came to be tagged as eccentric, freakish and even menacing. In 1997, the prominent Israeli television commentator Ehud Yari, who had for years been intrigued by the unique power of the Khazars, produced a short TV serial on the subject, cautious but full of fascinating information. What caused this silent lapse in the Jewish-Israeli memory? Aside from the traditional ethnocentric conception that in some form dominates every aspect of Jewish nationalism, there are two possible hypotheses. One is that the wave of decolonization of the 1950s and 1960s drove the Israeli memory merchants to avoid the very shadow of the Khazar past. There was anxiety about the legitimacy of the Zionist project, should it become widely known that the settling Jewish masses were not the direct descendants of the children of Israel. Such delegitimization might lead to a broad challenge against the State of Israel's right to exist. Another possibility, not necessary in conflict with the former, is that the occupation of large, densely populated Palestinian territories intensified the ethnic element in Israeli identity politics. The proximity of masses of Palestinians began to seem a threat to the imaginary national Israel, and called for stronger bonds of identity and definition. The effect was to put the kibosh on any remembrance of Khazaria. In the second half of the 20th century, the connection with the orphaned Khazars was steadily weakened, as the Jewish people gathered again in its original homeland after 2,000 years of wandering in the world. The age of silence in Israel echoed in many ways the silencing in the USSR, though in the land of Russian socialism it took place in the previous generation. Between Artimonov's book in 1937 and the 1960s, hardly anything was published about the Khazars, and those few publications were mostly devoted to their repudiation and denigration. The existence of those strange Jews in the East became, not surprisingly, an aberration from the historical logic of Marxism-Leninism and the character of Mother Russia that was reborn under Stalin. The proletarian internationalism of the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s was replaced, even before the Second World War, by assertive Russian nationalism. After 1945, with the rise of the Cold War and the accelerated Russification of the non-Russian territories, this became an even harsher and more exclusive ethnocentrism. All the Russian and, later, the Soviet historians who had written about Khazaria were denounced as bourgeois, who had failed to comprehend the common Slav traits and so played down the importance of ancient Kievan Russia. In 1951 even the daily paper Pravda joined the call to excoriate the Khazar parasites and their old erring and misleading interpreters. P. Ivanov, an establishment historian, probably Stalin himself, published an important article exposing the poor research on the Khazars, and asserted that our forefathers had to take up arms to protect our homeland against invasions from the steppes. Ancient Russia was the shield of the Slav tribes. It defeated Khazaria and liberated from its domination, old Slav lands, and lifted the yoke of Khazaria from the backs of other tribes and nations. The article made a point of attacking Artemonov, who had inappropriately shown sympathy for Khazar culture and had ascribed to it a positive historical role in the birth of Russia. The Scientific Council of the History Institute at the USSR Academy of Sciences met after the Pravda article and concluded that the paper had been perfectly correct in its reasoning. Now all the stops were pulled out, and the Khazars became damned and tainted beings, who had by ill fortune stumbled into Russian history. Only in the 1960s, with the partial thaw of the Stalinist frost, did the study of the Khazars carefully begin anew, but from now on, it bore clear nationalist, and at times anti-Semitic, features. But whereas in Israel and the Soviet Union, the two states to which the Khazar past was most relevant, Khazaria research was treated for many years as taboo, fresh materials were emerging in the West. In 1954 a thorough and comprehensive study of Jewish Khazaria, by a British scholar named Douglas Dunlop, was published by Princeton University Press. Dunlop showed a thorough familiarity with the Arabic literature on the subject, and great caution on the fate of the Khazars after the fall of their empire. In 1970 Peter Golden submitted a vast doctoral dissertation, entitled The Khazars, Their History and Language as Reflected in the Islamic, Byzantine, Caucasian, Hebrew, and Old Russian Sources. Parts of this scholarly work were published in 1980. In 1976 Arthur Koestler dropped a literary bombshell entitled The 13th Tribe, which was translated into many languages and provoked a variety of reactions. In 1982 the book by Norman Golb and Omeljan Pritsak, Khazarian Hebrew Documents of the 10th Century, laid the critical foundations for the subject. The popular work by Kevin A. Brook, The Jews of Khazaria, appeared in 1999. This non-academic writer also started an extensive website dedicated to the subject of Khazaria. Other works appeared in Spanish, French, and German, and in recent years many of the books mentioned have been translated into Russian, Turkish, and Persian. None of them appeared in Hebrew, except Koestler's 13th Tribe, which was issued in Jerusalem by a private publisher, who did not risk distributing it to the bookshops. Other than these, over the years there have been dozens of essays, articles and chapters in history books devoted to the history of the Khazars and its connection to Jewish history. There was even a scientific conference in Jerusalem in 1999, attended mainly by outside scholars. The event attracted little interest in local academic circles. Although the ideological pressure of the late 1980s and 1990s has eased somewhat, Israeli historians have not taken up the subject of Khazaria, nor have they directed their students to these blocked historical paths. But while the Khazars scared off the Israeli historians, not one of whom has published a single paper on the subject, Koestler's 13th Tribe annoyed them, and provoked angry responses. Hebrew readers had no access to the book itself for many years, learning about it only through the venomous denunciations.